Hello everybody, my name's Leith Van Onselen, the unconventional economist, coming at you again with another macro breakdown where I like to discuss issues of importance to the Australian economy, including the housing market, economic policy, etc, etc. Now today's topic is the question of whether or not excessive immigration is to blame for Australia's housing market. Now, the reason why I've broached this topic today is because there's been a lot of debate over the pandemic about the extent to which immigration has forced up Australian house prices, especially given the fact that over the last 2 years during the pandemic, immigration went negative, yet house prices rocketed. Now, the reason why I'm coming at you today with this is because an economist that I quite like and respect, Dr. Shane Oliver from AMP Capital, was featured in an article published in realestate.com.au on the 2nd of March 2002, where he did note that, quote, low interest rates play a significant role in price rises over the past few years and are also one of the catalysts for the decline in housing affordability that started in the 1990s. These low rates meant people could borrow more and therefore pay more for houses, and as we went into the 2000s, housing started to become more and more expensive and less affordable. But Dr. Oliver also notes that we saw a lack of supply relative to demand at that time, and that it wasn't that we weren't building as many houses, but we were building less houses than we needed to because of the surge in immigration that occurred through the mining boom in the 2000s. According to Dr. Oliver, quote, something got out of whack in the 2000s when we massively increased the immigration intake, but didn't increase the supply of housing to match. Dr. Oliver also pointed out that many countries around the world have low interest rates, but not all have had the expensive housing that Australia has, demonstrating that the biggest issue is lack of supply relative to demand. Now, I partly agree with Dr. Oliver, and I partly don't agree. Now, as I said earlier, Australia's immigration intake, after surging in the mid-2000s up to 2019, has gone backwards over the pandemic. The first time since really the First World War that we've had a negative immigration intake. So we effectively went from 230,000 a year immigration over the 15 years to 2019 to negative 90,000 over the pandemic. Yet over that time, dwelling values have surged by 24% across the major capital cities, according to CoreLogic. That's the chart on the right. So we do have this sort of disconnect where immigration's turned negative, but the housing market's experienced its biggest boom since the late 1980s. So that, if you just took that on face value, you think, well, hang on, immigration doesn't have any impact on the housing market because immigration fell, prices rose, or rocketed, in fact. Now, I'd argue that the biggest impact on house prices is mortgage rates and the availability of credit. Now, as the chart on the left shows, Australia's mortgage rates have been falling for, really 30 plus years. So mortgage rates peaked in 1989 at 17%. Currently, the standard variable mortgage rate, the average across the entire housing market, according to the Reserve Bank of Australia, is 3.5%. So that's ginormous reduction. And even over the pandemic, we've seen standard variable mortgage rates, the discount variable mortgage rates, fall from 4.15% in February 2020, just before the pandemic hit, to its current rate of 3.45%. 3-year fixed rate fell from 3.08% in February 2020 before the pandemic. It bottomed out at about 2.1% about a year ago, but just more recently, it's risen back up to 3.45%. So mortgage rates have fallen, a hell of a lot over the pandemic. The standard variable mortgage rate, which most people go on, it's the dominant form, has fallen to an all-time low. And once you add in stimulus and all the other stuff, being in lockdown obviously means people can't spend on other things. People have piled into housing, and that's driven house prices up. And with falling mortgage rates, the chart on the left shows that the mortgage interest repayment burden has fallen to levels not seen since the late 1990s. So effectively, mortgages have become way more affordable despite the fact prices have risen. Whereas total mortgage repayments, that's principal and interest, which is the green line on the left chart, have fallen to early 2000s levels despite the fact prices have rocketed. And these cheap mortgage rates have caused mortgage commitments, the number of housing finance commitments, to skyrocket. And as the chart on the right shows, there's a very strong correlation between mortgage growth and property price growth. When the value of mortgage commitments booms, typically that means a boom in prices. When it falls, that typically means a fall in prices. So at least, the correlation's there. Mortgage rates and mortgage debt are the biggest driver of property prices. There's no doubt about that. Except that doesn't mean that immigration is irrelevant. To me, I'd argue immigration is a longer term driver of house prices. Now, the chart on the left shows Australia's net overseas migration, basically all the way back to the early 1990s to just before the pandemic hit, or to 2020, June 2020. And you can see here that Australia's immigration intake accelerated massively between 2005 and the end of 2019. So Australia's net overseas migration rose from an average of 90,500 between 1991 and 2004, those 15 years, to 219,000 between 2005 and 2019. That's 140% annual average increase in immigration over that 15-year period from the 15 years prior. Now, the chart on the right shows that most of this net overseas migration went to Sydney, New South Wales and Victoria, which is basically Sydney and Melbourne. Those two jurisdictions alone accounted for nearly 2/3 of Australia's net overseas migration between 2005 and 2019 when immigration ramped up. And you can see there that especially over the latter half of those 15 years, New South Wales and Victoria took the lion's share of immigration. Now, what does this mean for house prices? Well, as we know, mortgage rates, tax policy, all those other things have been universal across Australia. So the only real difference has been the immigration intake. And as you can see in the chart on the left, Sydney and Melbourne home values have risen the most over those 15 years by far. And this, I'd argue, is due to the difference in immigration. Immigration boomed in Sydney and Melbourne. Therefore, their prices boomed and went up a lot further than everywhere else. Now, the chart on the right comes from the Reserve Bank of Australia, and this sort of highlights the point. It shows that affordability, so the house price to income ratio, which is a measure of affordability, has risen far more, by a far greater amount in New South Wales and Victoria, read Sydney and Melbourne, than it has across the other jurisdictions. Not only has it risen more, it's also at a much higher absolute level. So, the house price to income ratio in New South Wales, according to the RBA, is over 7. It's about 6.5 in Melbourne. In Queensland, by contrast, it's below 5, and in WA, it's below 4. And South Australia, ACT, Tasmania are all about 4.5 to 3.5. So there's a huge disconnect here in the house price to income ratios across Victoria and New South Wales, as well as Victoria and New South Wales have experienced stronger price growth over the 15 years the immigration boomed. Now, what does this mean going forward? Well, as we know, the federal government wants to reboot the immigration, the mass immigration program that we had between 2005 and 2019. According to the Intergenerational Report, Australia is going to bring in 235,000 net overseas migrants every year for the next 40 years. And this is shown in the chart on the left. Such a level is even higher than we had in the 15 years before the pandemic hit, or slightly higher, but it is way above the historical average around 80,000 per year. And what this will do is this is projected to increase Australia's population by about 13.1 million people over the 40 years to 2061. That's the equivalent of adding another Sydney, another Melbourne, and another Brisbane to Australia's existing population. Now, obviously, if you're going to increase Australia's population by about 50% in just 40 years, you go to place significant upward pressure on house prices, especially if most of those people land in Sydney and Melbourne. It's just basic common sense. So even if interest rates don't rise or they fall a bit, whatever, you'd expect that property prices would continue to rise in those areas where, which are effectively flooded in population. So if Sydney and Melbourne roughly double in size on the back of that immigration, you're going to get a big increase in property values, other things equal. It will also force Australians to live in smaller accommodation, like shoebox apartments instead of houses. Now, the chart on the right highlights this point. It comes from the Urban Task Force. And what it does is it shows the dwelling composition of Sydney in 2016, as per the census, versus its projected composition in 2057. And what the Urban Task Force suggests is that the share of people living in detached houses in Sydney is going to fall from 55% in 2016 to just 25%, whereas the share of people living in apartments is going to rise from 30% in 2016 to 50%. So we're going to go from a situation where just over half the people in Sydney live in houses to a quarter, while around half the people in the future are going to live in apartments and about a quarter in townhouses. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a pretty big dilution of living standards. When I was growing up, I knew very few people that lived in apartments. Pretty much no one I knew growing up lived in an apartment. Everyone lived in a house. We're talking about the 1990s here, 1980s and 1990s. Nowadays, about half my friends live in apartments. So, you know, and they're in their mid-40s. So, you know, we've gone from a situation where living in a house was the norm to now becoming far more, you know, common to live in an apartment. And in the future, the apartment is going to be the dominant form of housing in places like Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne, all because population growth is rising. Now, I'll just finally add, I'll put this in the last video, the Australians do not want this big Australia immigration. Two recent polls, the one on the left is from the Australian Population Research Institute, released late last year. The one on the right is from the Resolve Political Monitor, which was released in February 2022. Both show that around 2/3 of Australians do not want immigration to go back to its pre-COVID level. So we've got a situation where Australians don't want this. Australians don't want the big Australia. They're worried about housing affordability. People don't want to have to be forced to live in apartments. They don't want their kids to live in apartments going forward. And yet the federal government's going ahead with that anyway. And so we're effectively facing a situation in the future where only the very wealthy will be able to live in a detached house with a backyard. And basically everyone else is going to be forced to live in an apartment, all because we're going to grow the population continuously and expand the footprints of our cities. You know, places like Sydney and Melbourne are projected to roughly double in size over the next 50 years and, you know, making the mega cities of about 10 million each. Now, is this what we want? I don't think it is. So, you know, if you're worried about housing affordability and you're worried about, you know, quality of life, and you don't want your kids and grandkids to be forced to live in an apartment, I say push back on this because, you know, it's not really what we want. We should tell our politicians that we don't want, you know, return to big Australia immigration and that we basically want to go back to the historical average of about 80,000 a year or at least under 100,000 a year. And that'll take the pressure off infrastructure, take the pressure off living standards, and will ensure that more people can afford to live, you know, in their home and not be forced to rent or live in a shoebox apartment. Anyway, that's enough for me for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. The central question, is immigration the cause of Australia's housing affordability problems? Yes and no. It's a significant contributing factor, especially if you live in Sydney and Melbourne, but it's certainly not the only cause.